Man named by Interpol as the most wanted paedophile in the world has been arrested in Thailand. Police had been hunting.
These are the stories that only exist in the darkest corners of the internet. Stories so disturbing, so rotten at their core, that most people choose to look away. But tonight, we won't. There is a face, or rather, a distortion of a face, that once haunted every screen it appeared on. A swirling blur of flesh, pixels, and horror, hiding a predator who believed the shadows of cyberspace would protect him. He was a faceless, untouchable ghost wearing a mask, and they called him Mr. Swirl. But his real name was Christopher Paul Neal. And this was not just a story about a monster. This is a true account of how one man used a digital world to feed a sickness beyond comprehension, and how the world responded. Lock your doors, put on your headphones, and don't look away, because what you're about to hear may stay with you long after this video ends. This is Hauntress, and tonight we descend into the abyss.
Hauntress. The truth hides in the dark.
It began with photographs, hundreds of them, scattered across the darkest corners of online forums. Distorted images of young boys, their innocence stolen, their expressions hollow. But among these chilling pictures, one detail kept resurfacing. A man's face, swirling like a whirlpool, digitally warped to conceal his identity. For years, he was nothing more than a shadow, a swirling blur, a ghost embedded in horrifying images that circulated across hidden websites. Law enforcement couldn't trace him. Facial recognition software was useless, and so he became known as Mr. Swirl. But behind the swirl was a man born in Canada. Christopher Paul Neal, born in 1975, raised in British Columbia, a former teacher, fluent in both French and English. He had worked in South Korea, Vietnam, and Thailand. Always around children, always charming, always hiding. To those who knew him in passing, he was polite, intelligent, even likable. But Christopher wasn't interested in teaching. He was hunting, and the internet gave him everything he needed. He didn't just hide in the web, he thrived in it. His face, distorted by basic editing software, became one of the most notorious images Interpol had ever encountered. And when the images began surfacing, showing Mr. Swirl abusing young boys, sometimes as young as 6, the world recoiled. But no one knew who he was, until one breakthrough changed everything. In 2004, authorities stumbled upon over 200 images of child abuse circulating in online forums. all involving the same man. The children in the photos looked Southeast Asian. The man's face, a twisted swirl of pixels, unrecognizable, untouchable. Interpol knew this wasn't a one-time incident. These weren't stolen photos. They were souvenirs. Trophies of something ongoing, something sickening. For years, he remained a phantom. But in 2007, everything changed. A team of German computer experts at BKA, Bundeskriminalamt, decided to try something bold. They reversed the swirl, frame by frame, bit by bit, using software not available to the public at the time. They reconstructed a blurred image, and what emerged was a real face of a man behind the horror. The photo was clear, pale skin, a neutral expression, a face that looked ordinary, and that was the most terrifying part. On October 8th, 2007, Interpol released the image to the public. For the first time in its history, the organization made an international appeal to identify the subject, asking the global community for help. They didn't know his name. They didn't know where he was. But now, the whole world was watching. Within days, tips started flooding in. People from around the globe, teachers, tourists, started calling. Someone recognized him as a Canadian who had worked in South Korea. Someone else remembered seeing him in Thailand. And then finally, a name emerged. Christopher Paul Neal. Within hours of the public revelation, Neal boarded a flight from South Korea to Thailand, likely realizing the net was closing in. But it was too late. Interpol had alerted every major law enforcement agency in Southeast Asia. Christopher tried to vanish, slipping into the underbelly of Bangkok and then into the countryside. But the world was hunting him now. On October 19th, 2007, after more than a week on the run, Thai police tracked Christopher Paul Neal to a rural town outside of Bangkok. He had been hiding out in a rental house, staying with a young Thai man he had met online. Locals later recalled he acted nervous, anxious, always glancing over his shoulder. He knew his time was running out. When officers arrived, he didn't fight. There were no guns drawn, no dramatic chase, just a man, pale and expressionless, walking out of the house as if nothing had happened. But what authorities found inside his computer told a different story. Hundreds of images, videos, conversations, maps, names, records of at least 12 boys, most between the ages of 6 and 14. Some from Vietnam, others from Cambodia and Thailand, but those were only the victims they could identify. investigators believe the real number may be much higher. What Christopher had done was far beyond possession. He wasn't just a collector, he was a creator. He lured children with gifts, promises, sometimes even through their parents, and then he filmed the abuse. In some cases, he even coached the children to smile, to make it seem consensual, but nothing about it was. His laptop told the story he never would. And the images, those same swirling nightmares that had once haunted the internet, were now undeniable proof of a living monster. When police asked why he'd done it, he said nothing.
A man who spent 5 years behind bars in Thailand for sexually abusing children is expected to appear in a Richmond courtroom today. Christopher Neal returned to Canada last year and was placed under strict conditions, but he pleaded guilty in October to breaching those conditions, and the court expects to hear a pre-sentence report today. Neal's identity became known when experts unscrambled computer images of him children.
In 2008, Christopher Paul Neal stood trial in Thailand. He was charged with sexual abuse of a 13-year-old boy, and the evidence, the photos, videos, chat logs, made his defense impossible. He pled guilty, coldly and without remorse. The sentence? Just over 6 years in prison. The world was shocked, outraged. How could someone responsible for such a calculated and evil act receive a sentence that wouldn't even match the age of some of his victims? Thai authorities defended the ruling, citing limitations in their legal system, the difficulty of collecting physical evidence, and the fear of re-traumatizing young victims. But it didn't matter to those who watched from afar. For many, justice had not been served. After serving time in Thailand, Neal was extradited to Canada, where new charges awaited. But even in his home country, the full weight of his crimes was never truly acknowledged. He was sentenced again, this time for distribution and possession of child pornography. Not for the abuse, not for the destruction of lives, for the files. In 2017, he was released on probation, free, breathing the same air as his victims. And perhaps worst of all, he still denies responsibility. He never once expressed guilt, never once showed remorse. He walks among us, a man whose face was once a digital blur, now a sharp, clear, unforgettable. We often think that monsters hide in forests, in shadows, in the dark corners, or forgotten places, but sometimes they wear glasses, smile politely, teach in classrooms. Sometimes they live next door. Christopher Paul Neal didn't look like a monster. And that is what made him so terrifying. Because while the world tried to decode the pixels of a swirling mask, the real evil was never in the blur. It was in his eyes, in his silence, in the way he disappeared and came back like nothing happened. Mr. Swirl is not just a story about digital manipulation, or law enforcement, or justice. It's a story of how evil evolves, and how sometimes the system struggles to keep up. We may never know how many lives he ruined, but we know this: behind every swirl, every blur, every mask, there's a real face. And sometimes, the last face a child ever sees. Thank you for watching Hauntress. If you made it this far, you are one of the few willing to look into the abyss. But remember, the abyss is watching back. Lock your doors, trust your instincts, and don't forget, the real monsters don't always hide under your bed. Sometimes they smile for the camera. Until next time, stay haunted.